All right, so this week I am gonna spend a little time in this video talking about the film that you watched, Moonlight, and then you have a assigned reading that digs into it a little bit more, but there's a few things I want to talk to you about in addition to that. Before we jump into things, I want to remind you of a few kind of key announcements. One is you got your midterm grade report from me. Should have been last week. You received that from me. If you have concerns about your grade, if you have questions about the final project, please let me know. I hold office hours from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern time, so your time for most of you all. And you're welcome to drop by there. I've talked to a few of you. I'd highly encourage you to go onto Blackboard and to look at the instructions for the final project. You have your proposals due very soon. And the project altogether is worth 40% of your course grade. So it's built over time to really help you do well, because you submit a proposal and I'll give you feedback and suggestions and tell you if I think, this will work or how I would approach it. And then you present to your classmates and they'll give you some feedback and some ideas as well. And that's another piece of your grade. And then you turn in your paper. So it should kind of help you develop your ideas more. So by the time you turn in that paper, you should be really solid in what you want to share or present. But again, don't be afraid to ask me questions. If once you've read through all the instructions, I also in one of your previous lecture videos walked through the assignment. So watch that, go through Blackboard, and then if you are, wondering about how to approach it, you can either ask me those questions, now, come by office hours, or if you want to, you're more than welcome in your actual proposal. If you want to have the proposal first and then maybe afterwards, if there are questions you have for me, you're welcome to build those in as kind of a second piece of your proposal so I can help you. Because I want you to do as well as possible. And I'm very interested to see the kinds of things that you all are going to present and share with us. So just know that that is quickly approaching, even though it doesn't feel like it. The other announcement related to your grades is I will update your post grades, but you should have all quizzes for the most part because you got your midterm grade. Everything has been graded, your first exam, your weekly assignments. So if you notice any grades missing, or if you feel like you took a quiz but you don't see it, make sure you email me. A few of you have, and we're able to kind of work through things. If you've missed work and you're trying to figure out how to pull your grade up, again, you can submit late assignments. They are penalized for being late, but you can still get some credit, which is much better than a 0. So go back, complete those assignments, and do everything you can. I know that there's a lot going on in the world and a lot in your lives, so I know that you all can decide when you have time to do things. Again, there's consequences for that, but it's not too late to turn in things. I want to make sure that is abundantly clear. The final announcement I wanted to make is that your exam is coming up next week. So if you're watching this video, it means that you are keeping up with the things I'm posting on the website. There is a study guide that has already been posted, and I'll post a separate video the week of the exam, just walking you through kind of what you need to know. But what I will say is, if you would like to, you're more than welcome to take that study guide. And if you like to prepare by answering all the questions and, doing your essay questions and all of that ahead of time, I've said at the last exam that it was kind of closed book, closed notes. But if you decide you want to kind of answer the questions ahead of time and use those answers in your exam, I think for this one I'm perfectly fine with that. Again, I'm really just about you demonstrating what you've learned in this course and your understanding of these things, and there's no real way to cheat in terms of the essay questions I'm asking you to think critically about, and I'm far less concerned with quote unquote cheating than I am with hearing you think complexly about the things and the topics in this course. So if you want to take that study guide and you want to fill out and pre-plan out and work on your essay questions and your responses to the identification and things like that, feel free. And then you're welcome to just, take those things from your pre-work, your notes, and use those in the actual exam, because it's still work that you're doing, whether it's ahead of time or during the time of the exam. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that. So what we'll do now is I want to dig in, this will be a shorter video, just to dig into some things about Moonlight itself. And I'm assuming that many of you have seen this film, or at least you heard a lot about it, because when the film came out, it made a big splash, and for a lot of good reasons. And I just love this image of the different posters for the film. We'll talk a lot about lighting and the different representations of the main character, but it's just a really good reflection of the film itself. So the film came out in 2016. We'll talk at the end of this lecture about it winning an Oscar, but it made a big splash for many, many, many reasons. But how I want us to think about this, and something your reading assignment will dig into, is Moonlight as a more kind of contemporary version of the hood genre films we talked about last week, right? So this is, if you think about movies like Do the Right Thing, which was like the kind of prototype, and then Boys in the Hood is really like the first real widely recognized, or for mainstream audiences, hood genre film, right? And when people think of those, they often think of Boys in the Hood or Don't Be a Menace and things like that. Or Menace to Society, excuse me, I'm mixing up the films and the spoofs. But Boys in the Hood came out in 1991, so this is, 25 years later. A lot has changed, a lot hasn't, but in many ways, Boys in the Hood set the groundwork for ways that we visualize and talk about Black space, and particularly Black urban youth and identity on film, and what is depicted. But Moonlight does a lot of what, if you remember, you read that Keyword Cinema, and Michael Gillespie talked about film blackness, right? And he really said that it's about more than just representation or authentic depictions of, Black urban life, right? And Boys in the Hood really was focused on, like, John Singleton was trying to talk from his experience to other Black youth living in those urban spaces. And there was a lot of kind of questions of authenticity and representation, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But Gillespie really encouraged to go beyond that and to think about, more nuanced and complex questions and themes beyond just kind of like, what is Black life in the hood, right? And in a lot of ways, I think Moonlight really takes up that legacy to look at Black life in these spaces, but in a more nuanced and complex way, digging into some of the things that we don't often want to talk about, like addiction and abuse and homophobia, right? So it does a lot of good work, and we'll talk about that through the end, but I want to maybe first step back and talk to you a little bit about the kind of creators of this. So at the top, you'll see Barry Jenkins. He's on that picture at the top, left-hand side right there. And he's known for, really, he was kind of, and he still sees himself as an independent filmmaker even now, that he's had this big hit, but he was known for Medicine for Melancholy, which you may want to check out if you enjoyed his work, as well as If Beale Street Could Talk, which was an adaptation of James Baldwin's work, came out in 2018. So he's been working for quite some time, often focusing on questions of Black life and Black characters. He's a phenomenal filmmaker, and does a lot to really flesh out kind of complex interior life and a lot of nuance that isn't usually afforded to Black people on screen. So I highly, if you enjoyed Moonlight, I highly recommend you check out some of the other films. Yeah, I'll say that. I won't, fangirl too much, but I do really enjoy his work. So he's known for those two films, and the posters are there. But it's important to think through not just, I put from John Singleton to Barry Jenkins, because as I talked about, this really is like the next, the evolution of the hood genre film. But it's not just Barry Jenkins that is significant to how this film came to be. So on the bottom here, I have Terrell Alvin McCraney, who wrote the play that Moonlight was adapted from. And I'll talk about him in a little bit, and why their backgrounds and their experiences are particularly relevant, right? So not all the time when we look at films or books or songs, you know, we don't want to fall into the habit of always saying like, oh, this is just about the author or the writer or the singer's background, right? But sometimes that is an important piece of the puzzle, and this is definitely the case for these two. So, just a little word though on Terrell himself. I talked to you about Barry Jenkins. You know he's an Academy Award winner. So is Terrell for Moonlight, right, for a screenplay being adapted. But he was a MacArthur Genius Fellow grant recipient, which is a huge honor if you aren't familiar with that. He has 8 plays, I believe, that have been produced. And so he's really prolific. And I think right now he's the chair at Yale, if I remember correctly. So he, you know, in his own right, in the world of kind of playwriting, he is a big name. And so these two coming together to produce Moonlight, which there's some other folks that were involved, which I'll get to a little bit later in their role in this. But it's significant. So the movie itself is based off of a play called In Moonlight, Black Boys Look Blue that Terrell Alvin McCraney wrote. And that play actually was never produced, but instead it was adapted for this film. What's significant is that the movie is set in Liberty City, and both Barry Jenkins and Terrell McCraney grew up in Liberty City. Barry Jenkins is just a year older than him. They didn't know each other. They grew up a few miles away from each other, but in the same city and in very similar circumstances, right? So I bring up Miami because when we think of Miami, right, and especially right now in conversations around the election, people think of the Cuban American communities, they think of, you know, tropics, they think of all these other things, or when you think of Florida, but they don't often think about Black people and Black urban space, right? But Liberty City is a neighborhood within Miami that holds one of the largest Black populations in Florida, and very much is what you kind of see in the film and the context in which both Jenkins and McCraney grew up in, right? And it's significant that, you know, when we have this evolved, you know, 21st century depiction of the hood, it moves beyond just showing New York or LA, right? And shows us that this is an experience that is present in, you know, any kind of urban location where you have Black people, and it moves beyond just these major kind of cities on the coast. So I think it's significant that they're drawing from that personal experience. Beyond the fact that they both grew up in Liberty City, though, there's some other elements of their lives that definitely influence their work, right? So Jenkins was raised by a single mom who struggled with addiction to crack, right? And this is something that when I talk a little bit about interior life, I'll talk about Jenkins and how that experience shaped some of the characters that you see. Similarly, McCraney's mom also was struggled with addiction, and she also contracted HIV and died of AIDS. So they lived these lives in Liberty City that mirror that of Chiron in the film, and that, you know, they never knew each other, but they grew up in the same city and under the same circumstances of experiencing some of the things we've been studying of the kind of the negative impact of the streets, right? Where you're confined and you internalize that lack of, you know, those negative perceptions associated with Black urbanness, you know, and the violence and questions of addiction and drugs that become a part of that. You know, think back to those plays the poems that we read, and even Ann Petrie's work or Coates, where they talk about what is it like to be the person in those spaces that has to internalize everything you're seeing and experiencing socially around you, the lack of opportunity, right? You know, the sense that everybody sees you as a problem as a Black person. And unfortunately, some of how that plays out is people struggling with addiction and violence and things like that. We'll circle back to the fact that in some of the other characters, you see that it's not this one-dimensional thing, though, like drugs and violence are good and bad. You know, it's not black and white, which, again, that's that nuance that this play really gets into, and the film does as well. So we'll circle back to it. But it's interesting that both of these men come from this shared kind of cultural and geographic experience, and have such a personal tie to Liberty City, and we're able to come together to create this film. So let's talk about the film itself, and I want to talk about the role of black space, which I've talked about a little bit in terms of Jenkins and McCraney both being in Liberty City, but you see that show up in Chiron's life, right? So he's growing up in the projects in Liberty City, right? So this is 21st century, right? This is today, but you're seeing the legacy of all of those housing policies and social and kind of economic implications we talked about of the growing racial wealth gap and the lack of opportunity and the hyper segregation. Notice that when you see Chiron and the people around him, you see predominantly all black people, right? This is a black space within Miami. And then again, he's living in the hood. And on one hand, you see those things that we've studied. On the other hand, you see a very different story here in the way that he comes of age. I won't walk through the film in terms of plot right now. You already know this. By now, you should have watched the film because this is the analysis of it. But the film follows him as he grows up, and there's these 3 different stages that it really focuses on. But it is a coming-of-age tale, right? Just like the other hood genre films. What's interesting here is the way that Jenkins takes that coming of age, movie or narrative and does something different of it, right? So one thing is the role of community, right? And I put a couple of quotes here from Juan because he plays a huge role in Chiron learning to kind of love and embrace his identity and find his place in the world, right? So one thing is, you'll notice, Juan takes up this, what we might call a fatherly role, but it's not just Juan. He becomes his mentor, and he cares for him. But he brings him into the home, right? And him and Teresa, they have family dinners. But notice that family here is what's chosen, not just what's in your DNA. So this is kind of a contrast to what we saw in Boys of the Hood, where, you have Trey who's struggling, so the mom sends him to go live with his father, and his father's going to teach him how to be a man. Which, again, has its role and was important in that context, but that's not the message this film is saying. Juan, who is in every way the hyper-masculine, black man that fits those, kind of societal norms, right? On one hand, which I'll talk about the nuance in a second, right? He runs a drug syndicate. He has his home and his girlfriend and their house. But he also sees the tenderness of this little boy who was being bullied and takes him in. And he doesn't teach him how to be a man, quote unquote. He teaches him how to be himself, right? He also teaches him how to be a black person in a complex world. And there's 2 quotes I pulled out that really, I think, highlight this. One is where he says to him, "Stop putting your head down in my house. You know the rule. It's all love and all pride in this house." And this is very, similar but different from the relationship we see between Trey and his father in Boys in the Hood, right? He teaches him, yes, to be proud, but when Juan and Teresa are with Chiron, they're teaching him to be proud of who he is. And there's oftentimes where, he has to explain to him the slurs that his mother used or his classmates use. And he just says, as long as you're proud and you love yourself, that's what matters. It's a very different kind of message, right? But again, similar. It's just a more complex contemporary version. The other thing that's really significant is the way that blackness and space are depicted. So they're all living in this racialized space of, the streets or the hood, and you see a lot of the, common imagery and things, right? Like Juan is running a drug empire, right? And later on, when Chiron becomes black, he does the same, right? So there's these images and things you might associate with the streets, but it's also, I want you to think about the different spaces in which Chiron really has his coming of age moments, right? It's within the family home when they're having dinner. It's at the beach, which is significant because when you think of the water and you think especially of those beautiful shots where, he's floating in the water, or even how the film ends with him standing at the beach, he's looking out at the ocean, which is a space that is limitless, right? It transcends borders. And so in some ways it's pushing up against or challenging this idea of blackness being confined to these very specific urban segregated spaces, right? And Juan even emphasizes this when he's teaching Chiron when he's young, that blackness is so much more than what the dominant narrative wants us to believe about this particular ghetto or this particular city. And Juan, there's this quote where he tells him, "There are black people everywhere, you remember that. No place you can go in the world ain't black people." And it's such a beautiful quote because Juan is speaking from his experience because he's Cuban. And if you're familiar, with Cuba, and it's complicated because we have a lot of white Cubans in the U.S. because of the way geopolitics have operated, and because those were the groups that primarily migrated here because socialism threatened their kind of economic and racial privilege. But in Cuba, which I don't think I've shared this with you all, but I've been to Cuba several times. I've done a lot of research on Cuba. That was one of my areas. Cuba is filled with black people, right? When I go there, and you've all seen what I look like, and I speak Spanish, people assume I'm Cuban, and that's never a question. I blend in there. So that's something that some of you all might know simply because of where you're at, and you might have more, you might run into more black Cubans, right? But a lot of people don't know that. And for Chiron to meet someone who's black, who looks like him, but to say, your blackness isn't confined to Liberty City or to the housing projects you live in, but your blackness connects you to people in Cuba and all these other places. And when he looks out on the ocean, it gives him a different sense of, where and to whom he belongs. And so I think that's a really beautiful representation of space that kind of, is somewhat opposite of what we see in Boys in the Hood, where you see all those, remember the signs we talked about and the police tape, which really was about the streets and black spaces being confinement, and the only way to get out of it was, to be a man and to escape. Where here, this movie really isn't about escaping the streets, right? It's about understanding and coming into yourself and embracing yourself and who you are, and being connected to something beyond the streets, right? So it really isn't about like seeing the streets as a problem, but really recognizing that people live in and thrive and find their life and their hope wherever they are. And I think that's a really beautiful message that's a different depiction of black space than what we've seen. So that's some of the way this film talks about or deals with kind of coming of age and black space. The next thing I want to talk to you about is the lighting and the interior life. This film is known, and when it first came out, there were all these articles in the New York Times and everywhere else about the lighting, and I'm sure this is something you noticed when watching it. It does a beautiful, beautiful job of giving these close-up shots, which I've put a few of these here for you to see, and using lighting as a way to reflect kind of the humanity of the people who live in these racialized spaces, and to reflect the emotions that they're feeling at the time. So I have a couple quotes here, and then I'll dig into why this is significant. And so the first quote, you notice the blues and the purples and the pinks, but the blue, that comes from that quote, one, the title of the actual play in Moonlight, Black Boys Look Blue. But also in the actual film, that line is said, right? Something from Barry Jenkins when he talks about his films and the way that the lighting and the kind of beyond just the lighting, the way that interior motivation and complexity is given to these characters. He talks about this where he says, "My films are personal, voice-driven films about human characters and the place we live. Technically, I'm an independent filmmaker." He really loves saying that, even though he's had all this great success, he's not about making something for mass consumption, right? And really, John Singleton and the people who produced early hood genre films weren't either. Again, they were writing something from their experience as Black people growing up in these spaces to others, right? Of those similar experiences. And Jenkins, in a similar way, is just about producing art about the people like him. But he gives this voice and this complexity that's often denied it. And even in some of the hood genre films, especially with regard to women, we often saw kind of stereotypical depictions. Think about the scene with Trey and the crackhead whose baby's out in the street, right? It was such a one-dimensional image. And I told you I'd circle back to Jenkins and the playwright McCraney, who created the play that this is based off of. Both of them had mothers who were single parents who struggled with addiction. And unlike what we saw in Boys in the Hood, what we see with Chiron's mother is, she's complex, and we see at the end in that moment where they kind of reconcile and she admits her faults, right? As an addict, she's struggling, and there are moments where she is abusive and rejects her son because of his sexuality, but she also loves him, and she is conflicted, and it shows kind of the reality of her as a human being struggling with addiction rather than just some kind of one-dimensional warning about staying away from drugs, right? I think what you get because of Jenkins' experience is, and if you know the actress Naomi, I'm forgetting her last name right now, who plays this, she brought up some concerns before she took the role about, not wanting to play a stereotypical crack addict, Black crack addict woman. So they worked really hard, and I think because of their desire to show that complexity, you see someone as a human being who is struggling with an illness rather than just a stereotype and a question of like a moral deficiency, right? She's really shown as a complex human being, and I think particularly of that scene where she confronts Juan, and you can tell she loves her son and she's jealous of the relationship they have, but there's that moment of that contradiction. I told you I'd circle back to this with Juan because he is the mentor and he loves and he cares for, Chiron, but he also sells the drugs that Chiron's mother is addicted to, right? And so it's a complex thing, and this film depicts people in their complexity and not as wholly good or bad, right? It's not an easy cut or dry of like, here's how you be the good person and avoid the streets. It's just the reality of Black life in that space, and it shows the struggle and the way that someone may participate in a system but also, encourage someone to do good and find themselves within or outside of it. It's so much more complex, which is the reality of life for people, right? It's rare, I would say probably no one, but even if I didn't say in absolutes, people are rarely, purely good or evil, right? We're complex and we're struggling to find our way in this world. And I think that you can see that through the way the film uses light in particular and these close-up shots to kind of look into the souls of these folks and see what's beneath these images that the world might look at and just quickly categorize without understanding the people behind them. So that's one thing. The other thing with the lighting that I wanted to talk about is how bright the lights are, right? These bright blues, purples and deep pinks. And this is important because when we talk about this within the genre of kind of hood films, remember when we talked about Boys in the Hood, and if you're even familiar more recently with shows, TV shows like The Wire, when you're depicting, kind of Black urban life on screen, it's often what's called gritty realism, as they use kind of dark colors and, it's usually kind of grays and blacks, and it's nighttime, and it's really meant to emphasize this idea of like it's a bleak environment. Where in this film we have all these rich saturated colors that show the streets as not just this place of like bleakness and darkness, but of kind of vivid life, right? I think that Jenkins is trying to use Moonlight to say you can't just visualize Black space or Black life within the streets in these spaces as something you can cast away as like, oh, that's sad they have to live there, or it's just plagued with violence and drugs. That people, human beings, live there, and that they are complex and vibrant and struggle, and it's all these things at once. And he uses light to visualize that for people who are consuming and watching these films. So hopefully that's something you notice. That's a pretty beautiful contrast. The other thing I want to just circle back to is Juan himself. So if you think about that opening scene, you see him on the corner and he's checking up on, the people who are dealing with this corner guys. And again, it's meant to fall into what we expect of like the streets of like, okay, yeah, here are these black men on the corner, they're selling drugs. But then you get this fake out, right? Where, yes, that's true. It's not meant to be debunked. Juan runs a drug empire, right? But he sees then Chiron running through the streets and, running from these bullies and having this hard time. And he goes to find him and comfort him, right? And that is meant to shake up the viewer's perception of these people, because on the outside you might just, if people saw someone like Juan on the street with, the people he works with, they're just going to drive by and think, oh yeah, there goes some black drug dealers, fitting those stereotypes, not seeing him as someone who's going to chase down and help a child in need and then bring him into his home and mentor him, right? So this is just one of the ways that that this film, again, uses interior life and relationships to add depth, right? Not just to deconstruct. Remember Michael Gillespie said it's not just about showing, black life is, here's the good way and the bad way to be. It's about adding depth and complexity to things that we often just kind of view as one-dimensional. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is the use of music in the film, which I hope you noticed. And this is something I think is talked about a little bit in the reading, but I want to show you two clips to emphasize or to kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about. So I think most of you are from New York, but by now everybody's pretty familiar with, like, music that's been chopped and screwed. I think that most people are familiar. It comes from, this is a particular kind of subgenre of hip hop that is comes from the South. Now it's pretty mainstream. But what's interesting here is that in this film, we talked about how in Boys in the Hood and other hood genre films, they tried to use hip hop, right? You had both kind of, rappers who were in the movies and produced the soundtracks. And it was kind of this question of like, authenticity, getting people who are interested in the movies because of that. Well, this takes a very different approach, right? On one hand, he kind of avoids that because by now, in this was 2016 when it came out, hip hop is far less kind of, it was newer and in the 90s and more explicitly, I think, seen as a black genre, that it was an expression of the streets, where now hip hop is so mainstream and widely consumed by kind of white Americans in particular, and produced by a range of folks, and it's just been much more commodified, right? So there are times where we do use hip hop in this, but I think Jenkins was aware that a purely hip hop soundtrack wasn't gonna fully capture everything he wanted to show the complexity of life and emotion, right? He didn't want it to just be kind of a commodification. So what he did is he worked with Nicholas Bertel to make the soundtrack. And Bertel does scores for soundtracks all the time. And Jenkins said he was first kind of joking with him. And he said, hey, you can't chop and screw, a regular score, right? If you're familiar, scores are the soundtracks that are created, often kind of instrumental music. And, he was kind of joking. But Bertel was like, oh, you know what? I bet you I could do that. And started playing around with it. And they took Mozart and Beethoven and all these scores. And that is exactly what they did. They lowered the octave, they did things to, if you're familiar, they chopped and screwed the soundtrack. So it sounds like maybe somewhat familiar in terms of the instrumental music, but they've taken this specific method of creating music that is tied to black production, right, chopped into, and very specific to Black Southern urban spaces like Liberty City and other parts of the South, to produce something new. And I think that this is another really unique element to the film. And then they did the same thing with some more mainstream songs like Classic Man, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm just going to read that quote that Jenkins said about that. But I'm going to play you just a few seconds of these so you can hear what I'm talking about. So I'm hoping this is the one. One of them is where they take, again, that instrumental, typical movie score music and chop and screw it, and the other one is Classic Man. So let me see which one is which. Oh yeah, this is the instrumental. So I'm not going to play that whole thing, but see how, if you're familiar with it, it sounds similar, but very different from what you normally expect from a soundtrack kind of score. And then I'm going to play Classic Man, which maybe is more recognizable, so you can kind of see what they did here. Just a small clip from this, and I think. Baby, I'm a classic man. Through the hood like war. When everybody feeling so cold. Cool like that King Cole. Niggas get a bit of my glow. I got charm like a calm, motherfucker. Now y'all fucking with the wrong motherfucker. Cheap like. Alright, so again, I just want to show a clip so you can hear it. It's a good soundtrack too. Hopefully this is not get taken down because of the language, but we'll see. So anyway, I'm going to read you this quote where Jenkins in an interview is really explaining why, one, he wanted to use this method of having chopped and screwed music in general, and then why he did that in particular with the hip-hop songs that were included, right? The first part of the quote is up here, but the rest I'll read because I think I can explain this better than Jenkins does himself. So in hip-hop, that sometimes that pace is so fast that you miss things. And I don't mean literally miss lyrics. I just think there's an emotion in what these cats are saying that gets by you. When you slow things down, there's this emotion, this yearning. I think in some ways, in Moonlight, we're doing the same thing. There's this idea, especially in the story, of Black, which is what Chiron calls himself when he's a full adult, trying to project this idea of masculinity. But as his life slows down, you get to see that he's just sitting there. When he actually talks to someone, he can't hide all this shit that's very deep down. And then he goes on to say that he listens to chopped and screwed music every day. But he said he just sees something, there's something about it that resonates with him as someone who grew up in Liberty City. And it's the music he enjoys, right? And I think that, in using this method, he's also bringing attention to a Black art form that isn't usually given that analysis, right? That, yeah, you can enjoy the song and it sounds good, but there's something to slowing it down that he says allows you to capture the emotion and the depth in the music that that's often overlooked, right? Especially in hip hop, because as a Black musical art form that has been commodified and widely consumed, it's usually about the entertainment factor and rarely about kind of the artistic and the human production behind it. And so I think that that's one of the other kind of unique aspects of this film that I wanted to make sure you all were paying attention to. So I won't spend too much time on this, but we definitely have to address it. The big kind of major through line in this is the way that the film deals with Black masculinity. And we talked about in Boys in the Hood how that film, spends a lot of time on this notion that really the failure and the way out of the hood is to, learn how to be a man, right? But it's a very specific kind of learning, right? It's, and again, not to discount some truth in that, right? But it's very much like how Furious Styles is. He's tough. He's got his business. He's hyper masculine and heterosexual, and that's how you survive. And that in many ways becomes the narrative of the streets. And there is this pressure to perform that Black kind of hyper masculinity. But I think what Jenkins, and really what comes from, I think, the play itself, is complicating that for people who happen to be Black men living in these spaces, but maybe who don't fit into that dominant narrative, right? And I put a couple of images where you see, as a young child, I think there's a beautiful moment where Juan allows Chiron, who has a mom who's an addict and who is, abusive to him in many ways, and who just is bullied at school, and is a boy who is so disempowered, have a moment where he can just let his guard down and be vulnerable and be cared for. And where he tells him, let your head rest in my hand, I got you. That kind of security isn't something that he has had the luxury of experiencing. And so it's a beautiful moment, and we don't often see moments like that, particularly between Black men, whether it's this caring, mentorship relationship, or whether it's the intimate relationship between Kevin and Chiron, right? There's the beach scene. Or later when he's Black, and when he becomes Black on that bottom right-hand image, Black as in that's what he calls himself, he is the absolute picture of hypermasculinity, right? He's got his car, he's got his grill, he's playing his music, he's, running, at the head of this drug syndicate. Like he's everything that hyper Black masculinity demands. But there are those moments when he's talking to Kevin, or when, especially on the phone, where you see cracks in that, right? And the vulnerability of him having to project and to fit into that to survive, but desiring what he had with Juan in terms of someone seeing him and caring for him and allowing him to be a vulnerable human with emotions, because everybody wants that. Absolutely every human being wants to be seen and loved. And often Black men Black men and women and non-binary people, quite frankly, I think because of the way Blackness has been dehumanized, and Black women have been seen as, hyper masculine and strong, and they can bear everything, and Black men are always made to be, again, hyper masculine and tough, that there isn't that permission to be human, to be vulnerable, to, to want to just let your guard down and have somebody be there for you instead of having to bear the world, get by, and be there for everybody else. And so Jenkins and the film really focus on that within the context of Black masculinity, and that's partly, their experience. But I think that's something important that the film does in general, is pushes back on this idea that, that to be Black or to be a Black man and to survive means you have to perform this, impermeability, right? You have to be this, no one can get to me because I'm so tough. And the film shows that it's not until Black, or Chiron as an adult, reconciles. He doesn't stop being a drug dealer, by the way. He doesn't stop being this tough guy that fits all the macho kind of requirements, but he allows himself to be vulnerable, to admit what he wants, to reconnect with Kevin. It's not until he reconciles all those parts of himself that he finds his joy and his freedom. And that's why you see that last clip of him staring out at the ocean as a boy, because the film isn't about him escaping the streets. It's about him coming into himself and making peace and finding joy in his life where he is. And it's about him accepting all of who he is. And that's really the film's kind of theme and idea, is that, Black life and Black joy is about the fullness of coming into yourself, and not, these kind of narratives that you somehow pull yourself up by your bootstraps and move on, but that you can find your humanity and your life in different ways. And so I won't spend too much more time on this because your reading digs into it a lot more, but I wanted to at least address it. So for sake of time, the last thing I want to talk to you about is just the kind of broader significance. I told you that the film won an Academy Award, and if you remember this, I don't know if you saw this, if you watched the awards or saw the news, but this was that big Oscar moment where La La Land, which is this musical about LA, and remember when I talked to you about Boys in the Hood and the city is, or that was a video clip that didn't quite work. Your reading talked about LA as this city that's both dystopia and utopia, and the utopia part is like Hollywood is the place where your dreams come true, and that's kind of what La La Land was about. These struggling artists who are white, who come to LA, who work hard, and they find their way. The struggling artist finds their way, right? And it's a musical, and there's shiny outfits and all that kind of, it really is the epitome of that version, that narrative of Hollywood. Well, we had, in contrast to that, Boys in the Hood, which takes place in LA but gives a very different picture of LA by focusing on black space. Well, Moonlight isn't in LA, but it's giving us, again, that contrasting narrative of, here's the happy image of you can make it everywhere. And then there's this other experience of complex humanity and life within this black space. And these two films were up against each other for the Oscars. And they announced La La Land as the winner, and then in the middle realized, oh, actually Moonlight won. And it was a huge moment because this was a film, again, Barry Jenkins was an independent filmmaker, and he wasn't making this to be a Hollywood blockbuster. He wasn't making this expecting great reception because it's a film all about blackness, and that's not always widely received. And even within the black community, it's a film that is dealing with a lot of our kind of dirty laundry on the inside about homophobia, about pressures to be hypermasculine, about addiction, but it's a beautifully well done film, and was recognized for that and won that award. And it's significant because I think in a lot of ways it showed kind of the importance of these complex narratives of racialized urban space in contrast to that kind of Hollywood shiny narrative that you see in La La Land. But I think on a broader level, it shows how right now it opens up conversations and ways that we can think about black space and blackness in these complex ways that recognize humanity, that look at the importance and the role of community, and that think about the streets not as a problem to be solved, but as just a place where people live and thrive and struggle, and figure out what does it mean for people to fully come into themselves and their lives, regardless of where they're at or where they're going. So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully a lot to think about. And then I will have a short, so there's this lecture, and then I have another video that I want you to watch that I'll put up there that's not a lecture video. And then it should be enough to really get you through. So